I want to focus on this morning is being called into closer relationship with God. It's a really simple message. I think a lot of us grapple with it already, or a lot of us already know a lot about it. But the thing I really want to emphasize is the God in the boat. A God who is not distant, a God who is not far off, a God who, when we least expect it, actually gets into the boat with us. It's directly taken from the passage that Jacob just brilliantly read. Nigel was talking a lot about revival during that worship session, and I think it's a really good thing, because I think we all really need revival. We all internally need revival, the world needs revival, and a lot of us in the church run with this idea of, come on, bring on revival. And so I stopped myself to ask when I was preparing this sermon, why do we actually think this? Why do we think the world actually needs to engage with Christ? Why do people need to get closer in relationship to Jesus? And there's lots of different answers to that question, but I split it down into the good and into the bad. But before I go any further, I'm just going to quickly pray and check my watch so I don't go over time. Yeah, Father God, I thank you so much that you are here and that you are present. I thank you that you are a God who wants to get closer to us, who wants to grow in intimacy with us, Lord Jesus. You are not a God who is standoffish or indifferent, but a God who wants to get into the boat where we are. And Father God, as I preach this morning, I pray that you just make my heart and the hearts of these guys listening ready to receive what you want to say to them. Okay, so relationship with God. I think when we talk about the good of getting into relationship with God, we as Christians run with this idea that life is really awesome with the Father, and it so is. We'll touch on that in a minute. But I was struck recently when me and Vince, back in November, went to go take down the Wendy house with a really lovely couple for the bonfire night. We went there, they were really nice. They were sort of the old sort of couple that give you the best biscuits because you're doing them a favour, really sweet, lots of banter, lots of smiles. We felt really loved. But they weren't at all Christian. They weren't in the slightest saved. And crucially, even though we sort of talked about faith a little bit, not in an impolite way, they just didn't want to know. They were really happy. And when we talk about the world needing revival, we often encounter the majority of people in the Western world who just don't seem like they need it. And how can these guys be as happy as me? And I'm like, oh yeah, you need Jesus. And I'm like, well, I don't need Jesus. I'm just as happy as you are. And I couldn't get my head around it with these guys, because I was like, well, what's the point in trying to convert people who seemingly are already converted if they don't believe the same things that I believe? It's a really good argument. And I talk to my non-Christian friends at work, and I'm trying to say oh yeah, you need Jesus. And I'm like, well, actually, to their mind, all that they think I'm trying to do is just persuade them to a certain set of theological principles would actually mean absolutely nothing. And the reason I'm talking about getting closer to God in relationship is because it is not just about theological principles. It's not about a certain set of laws or commandments or anything like that. What being with God is about is being closer to Him. And for those of us who already call ourselves Christians, the crucial part of relationship is there is always something more. Whenever you are in your relationship with God, there is a greater invitation to come closer to Him. He is a God who is intimate with us, and that is beautiful. And for this couple who were taking down the Wendy household, life is really good for them, and that's fair because we're both human beings. They can experience joy on the same level that I can experience joy, but their joy is finite. Their joy will eventually end. We don't like to think about it because it's death at the end of the day, or it might not even be death. They might get separated. Don't say that because they're perfectly lovely, but you hear what I'm trying to say. But for the Christian, for the man or woman who calls herself in relationship with God, they're able to entertain an eternal relationship with God. Yeah. What is finitely good in this world, when magnified against the backdrop of eternity, is infinitely and eternally better. Irrespective of your feelings and emotions are the same, when you live life in relationship with God, when you are called closer to Him, you have an eternal sense of closeness that is not that is not finite. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. That's the first thing that I want to run with about the better thing, the thing that is more in relationship with God. The second thing comes pretty much taken straight out of C.S. Lewis. I'm just going to rip him off so shamelessly because he's an absolute legend. And he talks about the glory. we as Christians talk a lot about glory, and I'm not sure many of us actually know what it means. I mean, maybe you guys do because you're brilliant theologians, but I'm actually not entirely sure what it means. I can get my head around it, I can look at the definition, but in terms of what it actually practically and emotionally means, don't really have the foggiest. But Lewis describes glory as this. He describes a sunset. There's the majesty and beauty of a fantastic sunset etched across the sky is something that gives you an indication of glory. There's a hill in Cardiff, which is called the Garth, where I spent pretty much most of my childhood and pretty much most of my time when I'm down there. It's where I had my first drink that my mum knew about. And we go up there often for the sunset and the sunrise. And then there is a difference here, because when we witness a sunset, you cannot be part of it. You can see its glory, you can sort of look at it and look at it from afar, and it's a fantastic thing, but it's in the sky, it's far out of reach. And if you imagine that as the glory of Christ, it is something that we cannot quite get to. But when you entertain, when you engage with the relationship with that glory, you go from just witnessing to experiencing. Lewis talks about a glory which is something we don't just see, but something we experience, something which you are connected to. Relationship with God is not just an eternal relationship, it is an eternal relationship with glory. Making sense? Yeah. Cool, that is good news. The second thing I want to fold on to is, why does the world need relationship? And that's because the world is often devoid of true and right relationship. When I talk, I often talk a lot about my experience with the clients that I work at in Exeter with the homeless. And the running thing that I see with these guys is that they are missing out on true love. They're missing out on true relationship. And I don't mean sort of Disney princess dream world true love. I mean like genuine love that we were meant and engaged to be and live with. Jesus says, I have come that you might have life, but life in all of its fullness. I've added the but you get the idea. Life spent with God is life in all of its fullness, because it's life done in true love and true relationship. And when the world is not in right relationship, the world falls away into brokenness. And so the call for us is to come closer into the Father, to come closer into that true love, because it is what we were designed to do. A race car cannot be a tractor, and a tractor cannot be a race car. You cannot be someone who lives life without true love and true relationship. You might experience joy, you might experience happiness. You are not doing what you were created to do. And so the world is then separated from God. We talk a lot about heartbreak being a really painful thing. And I think there is no greater heartbreak than the heartbreak of God being separated from mankind. And that is the consequence of the separation when we don't entertain true relationship with God. Either theoretical relationship or relationship that has nothing to do with God at all. It creates that separation. And that heartbreak is one of the greatest travesties of the universe. And it causes brokenness here on this world. And so when we say the world needs revival, we want people to live in the good, the beautiful, eternal, glorified relationship of being with God, but also because the alternative is incredibly horrible. It is horrifying and it is scary, because it is engaged in brokenness and suffering. And so when we look at relationship not done in the right way, I think there are three things that sort of prevent us from doing this. Apathy, ignorance, and anger. And I think these are the same three things that Christians and those who aren't Christians experience. So say hypothetically you are a Christian, which I hope most of you are. If you're not, I would recommend it. But being a Christian, you can be prevented from getting into closer relationship with God because you're apathetic. You might say, well, I don't much need God because I'm quite happy where I am with the God that I know. I'm perfectly content in my cozy little relationship with God, and everything's quite nice, and I have a nice church, and teas and biscuits are quite good. And then there's also the ignorance. You might not know that you can get even closer to the Father, that there is always something more, and that there is always something greater. Or you might be slightly angry, and there's something might be deep inside of you that actually pushes away the idea of getting closer to the Father because you're upset with Him, something lurking within inside you. And the reason I touch on all of this. The apathy, the ignorance, the anger, the being in right relationship and the not being in right relationship, and all these different things. And why I touch on that when I'm reading on Mark 6, which I have yet to quote, is simply because I think Mark 6 demonstrates to us those same emotions that come with all of those things that the disciples experienced. I said that in a completely backhanded way. The point I'm trying to say is this: the disciples experienced the same things in Mark 6 that we experience on a daily basis. Being in right relationship with God, being slightly out of right relationship with God, being in the low places, the medium places, the high places. They go through seemingly the same emotions of apathy, ignorance and anger, and also the opposite, which is courage, joy, and all those certain positive emotions. And the different iterations of what happens in Mark 6, the disciples have very human and very real emotions. But at the end of this chapter, you have Jesus walking on the water, and the very lowest moment where the wind is howling and they're straining on the oars and they're desperately trying to get to the other side of the sea that they're on, they experience Jesus not just by sight, but by intimacy and connection. They have the culmination of all the highs, the lows, the mediums, the ups, the downs, the apathies, the ignorance, all of that has come before, all of the stuff that's happening. And what they get is a true and genuine encounter of a God who is not just distant, but a God who is close. Yeah. We can look at that. I'm just going to do a sort of brief overview of each different passage. And I want to try and create or help you guys explore what the disciples might have been thinking of in that emotion. And the reason I want to do this is because I want you guys to sort of picture yourself there. Once we've gone through most of the chapter, I then want to do sort of a weird, cheeky meditation exercise. We'll close our eyes and picture ourselves actually meeting Jesus and being on that boat. So let's start straight away. First, we have the rejection of Jesus in Nazareth, from verses 1 to 6. And some theologians, when I was reading the different commentaries, think that it might be Jesus getting rejected similar to when he proclaimed himself, what you've read in Isaiah, I am here today and reading in the synagogue, and that whole iteration. You see it in Luke 4, though it's debatable. But the key thing I want to demonstrate here with the disciples is that they've gone to Jesus' hometown. They're probably expecting great things because they've seen really cool stuff happen up until now. And this is where Jesus is all old friends, and they're quite in close relationships. They go in there, there's a lot of joy, and then suddenly there's not, because he's completely rejected. They don't like him. And interestingly, they witness the same things that other people have witnessed. They mention his wise teaching, they mention his amazing miracles, the amazing works that he does, and yet their reaction is completely different. And the disciples are witnessing this. The disciples are looking at a population, a group of people who can see the same things they're seeing, but have a completely different reaction. As a tangent to the point I'm trying to make, I think that's really interesting for us today, as you can demonstrate, witness, and talk about the same thing that might get person A saved or person A closer to the Lord, but person B doesn't, for a number of different reasons. In any case, I put this as sort of like the disciples are sort of riding a medium here. They're still seeing cool stuff, it's still cool teachings, but it's not that awesome, and it's not that bad. Next, they move on to the really high point of being sent out. The book of Mark, as I'm sure you're aware of reading it over the recent series, goes from scene to scene to scene to scene, so it moves quite quickly. Here they're on a massive high point because they're given the authority to cast out evil spirits, and they do really cool stuff. Maybe a bit scary, but they see amazing things happen. The thing I want to demonstrate here is that the disciples were young people. Most of them were probably younger than me. And I, for one, can tell you that if Jesus was here right now and said, go and do this, I'd be pretty gassed. The cool fact of the matter is that he is saying this right now, and he is right here, and he is sending us out to do cool stuff. So these guys would have been on an absolute high at this point. And then the book talks then about the death of John the Baptist. In this section, Mark doesn't talk about it happening right now, but the other Gospels do talk about it happening just after he was rejected at Nazareth, or at least receiving the news that it happened. But there'd been a lot of fear. You're on the high of seeing Jesus, send you out and doing really cool stuff, and then suddenly the person who a lot of the disciples actually looked up to previously is then beheaded. You get the news that he wasn't protected in the end, that he died. And perhaps even with your questions of Jesus' divinity, which you might have been wrestling with at this point, because you've literally seen him, silence a storm and then do a whole load of other stuff. these questions of his divinity might be silenced because he can't even look after his own cousin. His own cousin's gone and got beheaded by the person who's the usurper king in your land. So as a young person, you've gone from the high and now you're at the low. There's lots of different emotions going on, but crucially, the disciples were exhausted at this point. Before we get the feeding of the 5,000, which I won't touch on too much, it says the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So even though they've experienced the highs, even though they've experienced the lows and the bit in between, which most of us in here might be experiencing at different points in our life, at the end of the day, they are absolutely shattered. And I wonder how many of us are getting close to that point in here. No, it might not be the highest point in your life. It might not be the lowest point in your life. It might be a pretty decent middle ground. But how many of us are just tired with the sort of stuff that's going on? How many of us are just sort of like, come on. I've experienced a lot of this already and I don't really need much more of it. The beautiful thing that Jesus does is he actually isolates them to go and rest. He gives them permission to go and do it. He takes care of them. He doesn't just command them. He doesn't just send them. And he doesn't tell them that he will give them the rest before he sends them. He sends them out and then they get the rest. They're not aware of his whole plan. And yet, through their trust in him, they do it anyway. And they do get that opportunity. However, there is a twist that comes later on with the fact that they're then straining at the oars. But before we get to that point, let's just take a moment to imagine ourselves there with Jesus. Where I want you to be is just after the high of seeing demons get cast out and really amazing things happen, where you've got the privilege of being a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth, the proposed, the promised, the probable Messiah. The weight of all that walking is heavy on your knees. The things you've witnessed is heavy on your heart and on your mind. The past few months have been an absolute whirlwind. Picture what you can smell. Picture what you can see. Imagine what you can hear. Experience what you can touch. I'll just leave you there for a minute. Now Jesus called these guys into rest after all of that. So I now want you to do, just as the last exercise, is picture yourself in your current situation where you might be tired or exhausted. Or if you're feeling on a high, picture yourself in that high or on the low. But in that, I want you now to hear the voice of the Lord and what he's saying. What is he saying to you and what is he doing? Those same 4 things: see, hear, touch, smell. The reason I wanted you guys to do that is because now we're going to look at Jesus getting into the boat with the disciples, i.e. Jesus having that encounter with us. So hopefully what I want us to do when we finish is you've pictured that sort of interaction with Jesus with wherever you are right now, and then we'll picture how much more he can get into our lives, how much deeper you can get with those same 4 different senses. The reason I'm doing the senses, there's not anything spooky or supernatural about them, maybe there's, I don't know, but when you imagine yourself in a situation, if you focus on those 4 things, your 4 different senses, it enables you to picture yourself more there. So it's a helpful little exercise that you can do. In any case, then we get to Jesus walking on the water. So Jesus has said, right now guys, you can have a nice little bit of rest, it's all good, it's all chill, you've done a fantastic work. And they're like, oh, that's great. And then he goes and feeds 5,000 people, and you're a bit exhausted, but it's quite cool because he's just fed 5,000 people. Mark mentions that they sort of missed the quote to Jesus' divinity. With the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is mirroring what happens in Exodus, the manna from heaven. He gives a blessing and basically provides food where there is no food. The disciples missed that nod, but in any case, it's really cool. And they've finished this long, hard day. This might be where you were when you were picturing yourself. They've finished this fantastic little season, and they're going to go out on the boat, just them, just Jesus, have a nice time of rest. It's going to be great. Unfortunately, as they're out on the water, you guys know what happens. The wind picks up. The waves come in. Perhaps you in your situation right now feel like you've been granted a bit of rest, and then suddenly a big wind gust has come along. A big storm has brewed up. And it sort of takes you a bit by surprise, because they've been granted the rest, and yet even though they've seen Jesus have authority over the wind and the waves previously with the silencing of the storm, they're now thinking, well, if Jesus has the power over the wind and the waves, why have the winds suddenly come up if he's granted us this rest? Where the Sea of Galilee is, where it is, it's actually below sea level. So the seasoned fishermen among them would have known how dangerous it is when the wind actually brews up. Because when something is below sea level on a big body of water, you get this thing called dam gusts, which are like these big things of rain or wind that come straight down and can top your boat straight over, because it comes down and then sort of splashes out like that. So you'd have been absolutely terrified in this situation, and the disciples were. And then they're desperately trying to get this boat moving for fear of being floundered with the wind coming up against them. And then in the middle of the night, it says the 4th watch, which would have been about 3 to 6 a.m. So at the moment of pinnacle exhaustion, when you're at the most beautiful point of sleep, they're in the exact opposite place. They're in complete desperation. And they witness Jesus on the water. But at first they think he's a ghost, then they think he's a vision. And Jesus intends to pass them by. But instead of just passing them by, he gets into the boat with them. You know the story. What I want to draw a parallel on, though, is in Exodus 33, which I'm going to read out loud. With Jesus passing them by, he is nodding directly to Moses on the mountain. Cleo gave me these nice little post-it notes to try and mark where I am. But I've put them in the wrong part of my Bible, so it still takes a moment to get there. Give me a moment. Okay, cool. So I'm going to read it out loud. Because it gives a perfect representation of Jesus' divinity. So I want you to be remembering this passage and then paralleling it to where Jesus is when he gets into the boat. So it says this in Exodus 33. And the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you've spoken I will do, for you have found favour in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and where my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." The same word for pass by here in Exodus 33 in the Septuagint is the same as Mark 6, with Jesus intending to pass them by. what Mark is trying to reference here is the divinity and power of Jesus, which is that of God, which is the same level of power which Moses could not witness. He had to be hid behind a rock, hid behind God's hand, and look at the back. He couldn't even see the Lord's face. And what Jesus does is get into the boat. The reason I'm getting excited about the God in the boat is because the God cannot be in the boat. The God is a distant God who is far away on top of the mountain, who you cannot even imagine a glimpse of, who you cannot even comprehend the face of. This is what Jesus is trying to reference. The whole of Mark is full of nods and exaltations to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, and it's the disciples who are struggling to understand it. And as he is demonstrating his divinity by walking on the water as a reference back to Joel, and trying to pass them by as a reference to Exodus, all that divinity and all that glory comes face to face with man. It is awesome, because I think a lot of us in the church, a lot of us in Christianity, and a lot of people who are outside of Christianity imagine God as a God who is so distant or so far off you can't even begin to comprehend any relationship with him. Jesus doesn't just demolish that by just being a vision, by being something you can witness or sort of see in a sense of that sunset, a glory you can witness far out on the mountain with your first ever cider that your mum knows about. He is a God who gets into the boat. He is the sunset in the middle of the storm. He is the sunrise right next to you. If you feel like you're straining at the oars and you can't pull against the wind, Jesus is holding onto the oar with you. And he's not just doing it because he's a friend, he's doing it because he's God. This is the life which we live as Christians. This is the call which we are called to do. Because if you don't feel like you're face to face with the divine, if you right now don't know whether you experience a God who is sitting right next to you, then my friend, you can get closer. You can have more. Because if we go back to the beginning with that couple when we were pulling away the Wendy house, a couple so happy with such fantastic biscuits and such great banter. But for them there was more, because they can come face to face with God himself. Not God itself, but God himself. The world needs a God who is close. The church needs a God who is close. And the ironic thing is that we have that. We just sometimes don't get closer. Is my microphone popping? Do I need to switch microphones? Yeah. I'm just going to make sure I haven't missed anything. So I want to now go on to my concluding point. Yeah, I have missed something. In Mark it doesn't talk about this, in Matthew it does. The story of Jesus walking on the water, we all know as Peter actually getting out on the water as well. This is something that I thought was absolutely brilliant, because I was studying Mark and I was like, oh, this is really cool, yeah, that's really good. You know, Jesus gets in the boat, great, divinity, awesome. I then referenced it against Matthew. I was like, oh, hang on, there's even more than that. Because the Lord can call you out of your situation. He can call you out of the storm, out of the boat, to then walk across the water like the divine and hold out your hand and engage with him. That is awesome. And I say like the divine because in Joel chapter 9 verse 8, Job chapter 9 verse 8, it talks about God trampling on the waters and walking across the waters. And again in the Septuagint, it's the same word that you see in Mark. And so when you see, and in Matthew, so when you see Peter walking across the water, what Jesus is calling Peter to do is come to be in community with him, to be raised up out of the human and into the divine. I'm not saying we're gods by any stretch of the imagination, don't hear me wrong. What I'm trying to get across is that when the Lord sees you, he sees his son because he looks at the cross. Doesn't see any of the flesh stuff. He sees someone who's made in the image of God. He sees a child, he sees an adopted son or daughter. So sometimes we need to accept the invitation out of the boat. Sometimes we need to get up and take that brave pill, hop over the side and jump on something we think is completely impossible, which is a sea whipped up by the wind, which we can't even stand on top of. And this is what I want to sum up with. Because the whole message of the gospel, for a world that isn't in relationship and for a church that is that as we know, God did not come to set upon a certain set of rules, commandments, a different theology which we, wasn't good enough in the first place. He came to have community and connection with us. When Jesus comes again, he's not bringing another set of commandments. He's not bringing another set of theological rules. What he's come in for is his bride. The perfect epitome of what it means to be in relationship. There is no greater love than a man and a woman, two people deeply in love with each other, accept the love that Jesus has for his bride. All that intimacy, all that connection, all that trust, all that journey, all that closeness, the highs, the lows, the mediums, the in-betweens, the same things the disciples experience, the whole of life. Jesus has that with you, because that's what a married couple has with each other. They've had that experience. That is what he is coming back for. That is what we can get excited about. Ages ago, I was back in Cardiff, and there were these Islamic evangelists, really, really lovely guys. But I remember getting into a bit of a debate about them, and they said to me, "Where does Jesus say, get down on your knees and worship me?" I didn't have a direct answer for that. I could point to different things about Jesus and stuff like that, but I didn't have a direct answer to that question. And it started a really cool journey of getting into apologetics and stuff like that, which led me into theology, which was lush. But I think the Lord actually gave me an answer which really satisfied me recently. And it's in Matthew 16, where Jesus says, if you pick up your cross and follow me. The worship that Jesus wants is sticking to commandments, is doing what he wants us to do and loving your neighbour as you love yourself, crucial parts of Christianity. But true worship is found in relationship with him. Because he asks you to follow him. He asks you to surrender everything to the point of death, to pick up a cross which you haven't even already picked up, but to pick up one and follow him. To follow someone is to be in connection with them, is to know them. If I'm following Cleo to the art shed to help her move a pot, I'm in connection, I'm in relationship with her, and I'm going where she's going. She's guiding me, she's helping me, she's encouraging me, she's giving me advice of where she wants the pot to be moved, which is very specific. But also, she is in relationship with me. I'm journeying with her in that. Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. So, the God in the boat. The God who wants to get closer to you, the God who wants to hop into the boat with you, and the God who invites you to get closer to him. Wherever you are at, on that high, low, medium, apathetic, ignorant, angry, or none of that at all, he wants to call you closer. So I will finish with this. For when the waves roar and the wind howls and you can't hear a thing, when you can barely hold on to your oars for even dear life, for your fear is so great and the waters are all so surrounding, and the wind is so strong, and you can't strain at those oars any longer. And even when the voice of the Lord feels so far away, and the truths you believe in are tested far beyond what which you could even possibly even comprehend, even then, even in that moment, in that scene, season or experience, Jesus is not absent. He's not a God, he's not a disembodied spirit you can merely entertain a glimpse of to give you the slightest bit of hope. On an experience you can't be too sure was even God or was even real. But Jesus is. Jesus is. He's not an idea, he's not a ghost on the water or a fleeting vision. He doesn't just simply pass us by. You can't just even witness his hand. He exists. He is real, and he is alive, and he is oh so close. So close he does not pass us by, which in itself would give you a glimpse of glory, which could probably even change your life. But he is so close he gets into the boat with you. He is a God who is closer than a friend, closer than a brother, closer than a spouse, closer than any possible experience you could ever have or have ever lived. He holds your hands so soaked in fear and water. He affects the ballast of the boat that you're in. He stands at the oars with you, pulls as hard as you, and encourages you to pull even harder. He speaks so clearly the wind and the waves obey his voice, that even the things that surround you are under his authority. Jesus will be, Jesus was, and best of all for you right now, he is currently. And furthermore, he is here right now, and he is calling you closer than you already are, because there is more for you. So if you will grant me this, please close your eyes for just a couple more minutes. I want you to picture yourself on that boat. And I want you to picture Jesus. And I want you to picture him getting into the boat with you. And I'll leave the rest up to you as you enjoy that moment with him in that boat with you. Sweet. Cheers, Dean. He's calling you closer. That's the point of this. Could have just said that at the beginning and saved you all half an hour.